Director Brisbo, formerly, is the head of the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, soon to be the Cannabis Regulatory Agency. And with that, I know I'm pretty brief because I was just on the hemp hour. You're going to have some of the hemp products that come under your purview. Why don't we start with that before we get into the cannabis stuff?
Yeah, so we will have oversight of everything beyond harvest. So the Department of Agriculture will still handle the licensing and oversight of hemp growers, and our agency will work on licenses and standards and regulatory oversight of processing. So everything that goes into making consumer goods.
Okay. And I know you guys got a gazillion questions, so fire away.
Director, we just had that big meeting this morning, talked about remediation and a lot of other things too. What were your key takeaways from what was said today? Anything that is top of mind for you?
Well, I think that the perspectives that were shared underscored what we thought we'd hear, that there are, I wouldn't say differing opinions as to the safety of most of the processes that are engaged, but differences of opinion on whether consumers need to know and how they need to know. So that's why we wanted to ask those questions, to have an open dialogue about what processes we look at, what kind of labeling or notification should be required. And I think it was really interesting to hear those perspectives. So we need to take that back and try and synthesize it and continue to engage on this topic. I think we're going to do a little research as to how other states handle issues of remediation and labeling as well. I do think the one thing that came across loud and clear from a consumer perspective is it really doesn't matter whether the products have failed testing or not and then are remediated, but if they're certain processes are engaged, whether that's RAD or ozone or the use of a willow machine or any of those types of things, that consumers who want to be informed if any of those processes are used. So I think that was helpful perspective to understand.
And we had a couple ladies from Detroit come in, and unfortunately, I know that there's not a whole lot you can do as far as oversight of the Detroit program and how that's proceeding, but can you give us just a general idea of how the MRA is feeling about what's going on in Detroit? Clearly, it's the largest market in the state, and it's still not ready for adult use yet.
Yeah, we have a good relationship with the city of Detroit. Sometimes I can, like the women who came today, I was able to help them get a contact in the city of Detroit behind the scenes. You know, obviously they go to the council meeting and all the public meetings, but there are other folks they should know and have conversations with as well. So we can always help in that way. We definitely are watching Detroit with great interest. I think participation in the state's largest municipality would help on a number of fronts. Obviously, we're committed to trying to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in the industry in terms of those who are operating businesses. So having a city of Detroit on board where you have a high percentage of potential for minority ownership is going to help bolster the state's numbers overall. I think having readily available, regulated, legalized access in the city of Detroit will also help to tamp down illicit operations and some of those sort of fly-by-night delivery services that are posing as though they're licensed operations. The confluence of good ordinances and access seems to have benefits across the board. But I know the city and the council are committed to trying to get things right, trying to find ways that they can encourage local ownership and diversity in the ownership ranks of businesses in Detroit. And that's a very challenging concept to navigate and do it in a legally defensible way. But I'm confident that they'll get through sooner rather than later.
Daniel?
Yeah. My biggest question, I have several, obviously, because I don't get to talk to Mr. Brisbo very often, but the first one is in regards to the MRA bulletin that got dropped about 11 a.m. Friday to go into effect at 8 a.m. Monday. I understand the need to, get the forms and everything updated and changed around, but the lack of a grace period or some sort of period, because as many know, we're primarily a licensing and compliance firm, and we can have 10 or 12 clients in Excella at one point. Is there any leniency or any grace period on any of those forms? Because we're a small company and we're thousands of dollars into this procedure, and then it just gets pulled up from underneath us.
Yeah, we can work with applicants to make sure they can navigate the process. I think the majority of our applications are submitted online, so that really helps too, to have some flexibility. But most of the modifications to the forms are subtle in nature. So anyone who's working through the process can communicate with their analyst if they're to that point, or we can work with folks. The nature of rulemaking is that it's a this was a year-long process, and we've tried to be transparent about what was changing. But when the rules go into effect, they go into effect. We have to wait out those 15 session days. We're never sure necessarily if the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules is going to ask for a hearing or introduce legislation to try and override the rules. So we just have to wait for that process to be completed and to become effective. But we want to make sure that businesses aren't negatively impacted, that applicants can still navigate the process. So we're happy to work with folks to make sure they can get from the beginning to the end.
That is great news, and I appreciate your feedback. The next question is, there's a lot of fear with our processors here in the state with this new hemp ruling and the availability of hemp coming out of THC. We've actually even had a gentleman on the store that was talking about wholesaling 1 gram carts for $5. Is that something that's going to be allowed, or is there some sort of control mechanism for that?
So we had the hearing on 216 that's for the rules package that would allow for the conversion of CBD distillate into Delta-9 or THC distillate overall. We've been allowing research and development to occur through licensed processors for about a year now, maybe just over a year, where they're engaging in some evaluation and they're allowing us to get some insights into how they're doing those processes. We only have a few of them doing it. They're using a variety of methods. So we're still working on getting the feedback from the rules. Usually that takes us about a month to get to a point where we review it and determine if any changes need to be made. So we're not even quite to that decision point yet. I was at the public hearing, but I have not personally reviewed all the written feedback, and we often get more written feedback than we do verbal in-person feedback. So my staff looks through all of that and synthesizes it and recommends any changes based on that. But even so, that would simply create the pathway for those processes to get approved. But we still don't have any of those processes that are at a place where they would be approved based on the draft rules either. So what the impacts are going to be. And I hear the concerns about the economic impacts that could be occurring. At the same time, the agency's been committed to supporting innovation in the industry as well. So we kind of have to balance those two things and ultimately just ensure that consumers can be as safe as possible. So more to come on that front. No decisions have been made as of yet. But again, even if those rules go into effect, which we still have to finish out that rulemaking process, there would be an evaluation of those individual processes to ensure that they can be done safely. And we're not at the end of that research and development phase yet.
Yeah, while I'm all for hemp being, allowed to do that from Michigan, because hemp actually scrubs the soil that it's grown in. I mean, it's a win-win for everybody. But the biggest concern I've been hearing, and mine as well, is out-of-state hemp coming in and being converted. Is there a fail-safe for that?
Well, the dormant commerce clause would preclude us from saying you can't import a federally legal product. What we can do is make sure that it's subject to the same standards as that's grown in Michigan. So you would be able to import raw industrial hemp, but you couldn't import the converted THC oil because at that point it's a marijuana product. So that would all have to be done in Michigan.
Okay, thank you.
There's a real concern, though, that oftentimes if you're allowing imports of product, it may, especially since the end game is to produce a oil that contains a high THC, that some of that hemp coming in from other states might have some liberal adjustments of some high THC stuff from some states that are trying to get rid of a terrible oversupply problem. Are we testing this cannabis when it arrives in the state to make sure that before it's put into any processing, it conforms to the 0.3 threshold that we have established? I think that's a critical factor to determine whether or not those processors should even be allowed to handle that as a hemp product.
Yeah, that's something that's covered in the rules, and in two ways. It has to be sourced from a legally compliant source. So it's got to come from a manufacturer or a farm that's approved from the state that it's in, or in some cases, states don't do the approval. They just leave it up to the USDA. So it's got to be compliantly sourced and it's got to be compliant product. And that testing does have to occur. would have to occur if the rules.
That would occur in the home state where it originates from, though, correct? Not in Michigan?
No, the processor would have to run tests on the raw material as well to identify, to ensure that it's compliant product. Yeah. And I think your concern is well noted, that we didn't want to just turn this into an input for, THC oil to come in and just say that it's CBD oil. Yeah, the conversion process would be pretty easy then, right?
It would be. Now, one of the concerns that was expressed during today's meeting is the ability to remove acids and chemicals from a conversion oil. And that's one of the things that the MRA has concerns about, which is why you have not approved a process for creating that conversion oil yet. Would that be a correct statement?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the difference between the testing protocols for naturally sourced product and something that's made through a chemical synthesis are completely different. We don't require tests for, marijuana flower, for example, or THC distillate to run the gamut of everything in the world that could contaminate it, right? Because it's a botanical product. So we test for the things that we know might be issues, right? We control what pesticides can be used, and we test for the residual solvents that are commonly used. It's also why we don't test for every possible pesticide. We test for the ones that we think are most likely to be used in this space, and that keeps evolving. When it comes to chemical synthesis, it's really going to be process dependent. So one of the things you may see in the rules is a potential requirement that the specific process utilized by a processor, should it be approved, can't be changed without notice to the agency, which includes all of the potential chemical catalysts and inputs that may be used. And it may require its own very specific testing panel that could include testing for byproducts that are specific to that individual process. Because depending on the inputs that are used in the process they're using, that could change the byproducts we want to test for. So if we had, say, 3 processors in the state that were authorized to engage in this conversion process, they may have 3 different testing panels. And that would include all, the tests that are required, generally speaking, of any of the products in the marijuana market, but it could include additional testing as well. And if they wanted to make any change to that process at all, they'd have to go back through the R&D review process and get specifically approved for that new process.
Let me leave him real quick. Robert Champion's on the show, Director Brisbo. He's a new player in the space. His company comes out of the food and beverage industry, does packaging, equipment for packaging. Do you have any questions for the director, Robert?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think thanks for joining us, Director Brisbo. I heard you say, the moving from MRA to CRI or whatever.
CRA, yeah.
CRA, yeah. So you said more of the regulatory body is around processing and regulating that. Is it also just as important with this with the CRA to do packaging and labeling and kind of what goes on the label, and are you following some of the lessons learned, say, out of the food industry and some of the things that they've done and some of the regulatory guidelines that they follow?
Absolutely. So on the marijuana side, I think the approach that we've taken is to consider marijuana infused edible products as food with an extra ingredient. And obviously they have intoxicating effects. So we have very tight controls on marijuana infused consumable products. But we've attempted to adopt a lot of the standards, more so on ingredients, labeling in terms of additives and the nutritional kind of labeling that you would typically see in the food industry. That we've adopted those same CFRs when it comes to process, but sort of recreated those in the rules. I think there's an easier way to do it with hemp, where we just point to the standards that exist in the appropriate context. So if it's a food product, we just point to the CFRs that dictate what labeling needs to look like. If it's a cosmetic product, same thing. I think that allows for the best experience for consumers, because we're all used to looking at packaging and nutritional information on food, and it's organized in a certain way. So adopting similar standards and just pointing to those instead of rewriting them all in our rules, I think is a simpler approach. So that's kind of where our heads are at right now.
Okay, thank you.
Guys, I know you got more questions, Rick.
Director, you're involved in a national regulators organization, which means you get to have some meetings with people that we don't get to talk to. What do you see on the national front? What's the buzz amongst the regulators around town?
Good word.
Well, there's a lot of conversation about novel cannabinoids happening right now on the ground. Like we're all dealing with those same issues. Consistent conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion across the board, because that's a key issue in all states that have legalization. And then, yes, trying to keep tabs on what's happening at the federal level. You know, we've got the safe banking bill that's passed, I don't know, the fourth time through the House now that keeps getting stalled. That's incremental cannabis reform. But then we look at the MORE Act or the CAOA or the SRA, and those are more holistic reform packages. So our goal has been to engage with policymakers at the federal level, select committees where we know some of those bills are going to run through, as well as federal regulatory agencies to share a state's perspective. Ultimately, when cannabis reform happens at the federal level, that move toward legalization, decriminalization, all those pieces are going to be novel issues at the federal level. So they need to rely on states who have gone through that process. Like we understand the pitfalls, we know what's worked and what hasn't. And like I will tell folks, when Michigan legalized and we had to implement a regulatory program, we dealt with the exact same issues that we saw occurring on the timeline in Colorado and Washington and California, but also all the new issues of the day. So that's happening in new states that come on now. If you legalize in 2022, you're dealing with every issue from 2008, 2012 and beyond all at the same time. Well, the federal government's going to have to deal with that as well, only on a much grander scale. So we want to be a resource and we want to be a voice at the table, not to advocate for any specific approach, but just to, share our expertise on what's occurred in the states and how best to implement, federal policy reform.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and you're always so good at answering all of our questions. I have a fun one, as typical of me. Where do we find someone to make us a beautiful painting with marijuana spelled wrong?
There's only one of those in the world, and that is mine. I was on the last show. I was saying that's going with me when I leave this job, because that was a present to me from my former director when I moved over from the Bureau of Professional Licensing to establish at the time the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation. And the funny thing is, so Lola Rivera is the artist who's behind that. And the best part, when she told me she put this together, when Kim Gaedick was the one who asked her to do it for me, she said she didn't even know what marijuana looked like. So she just had to Google pictures of it. And I think she did a pretty good job with her artistic rendering of the cannabis plant.
Well, I was telling him on the other show, this should be the new CRA logo. I'm thinking, that would be perfect. Right?
The pure Michigan people would kill us for that. Proprietary.
I do know a site where you can have that particular image made into a pair of socks, though.
Oh, yeah. That would be
there you
good.
go. There you go. Now we're talking.
An NFT.
Yeah. Was that? Oh, right. Yes. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Of all the things in the world that I don't understand, cryptocurrency and NFT is right at the top of my list.
Yeah, I'm still figuring it out myself. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about I know we always like to pester you on numbers, but I think we had you on the show. It was either December or January when we came out. I think it was January when we came out with the 2021 numbers. And at that point, I know we're only a couple more months into 2022, but you were saying, you think it's going to be around 2.8 this year. Is that still your prediction, or do you think it's higher or lower, or what?
No, I just saw that get reported somewhere too. And I asked David, our media guy, did I tell someone it was going to be 2.8 billion? Because that seems too high. So that is too high. I don't think we're going to get there. We only have, 1 month's worth of data to look at in calendar year 22. But if we use that and extrapolate that, we're looking at about 1.8 billion still this year. But I don't think January is going to be the high sales month. But when we look at the value of the products sold, we have to consider the fact that the retail price went down 53% last year in both medical and adult use. Or I should say that's over the past 12 months. So that the volume of product being sold continues to go up every month. But with the price going down quickly, we don't see the same total value of sales occurring. So I think in factoring that in, we'll probably see total sales in 2022 exceeding 2021, but not by nearly as much as we might have predicted at the end of last year.
Director, someone on social media today said there was about 30,000 pounds sold in Michigan on a monthly average, but in metric, there were about 280,000 pounds of flower listed. Does that sound about right to you? to me, those are numbers that indicate that we're rapidly moving towards an oversupply scenario.
I'll look at the numbers right now. Hold, please. We'll be with you shortly. So this is at the end of January. On the medical side, we had about 29,000 pounds of flower that was available at provisioning centers, about 43,000 pounds at retailers. I did look at some numbers from January 21 to January 22, and the percentage increase in the volume of sales versus the percentage increase in the amount of flower that was in the supply chain at various places was scaling at about the same rate. Certainly, if we saw that the volume of production or the volume of flower that was sitting on shelves was scaling up faster than sales were, then we definitely get concerned about oversaturation. I think it's an important conversation to have, though. We don't want to see the same kind of oversupply concerns that we saw in Oregon. That can lead to some challenging behaviors. It can lead to challenges for businesses, particularly small businesses, to be successful in the state. At this point, though, the agency, our role, we don't have any control over that. We issue licenses to whoever's eligible. We continue to issue more licenses. We are starting to see the trend that we expected to occur, that businesses are continuing to push their investment on the adult use side. So we actually had a net loss in the number of licenses on the medical side for the first time in our history. We have 59 fewer licenses now than we did a month ago. So I think, as we all kind of expected, the businesses just aren't renewing those medical licenses as they continue to move toward adult use. Those are all factors for us to keep an eye on and engage with stakeholders to understand what the needs might be. So if the agency is to play a role in supply and the number of licenses in terms of how many there are supposed to be, that would take a legislative change. So it's really important to look ahead to those issues and determine what actions, if any, need to be taken and engage with stakeholders and legislators to do something about it when the time is right.
I mean, we gave 40 stack C licenses to a single facility. So that's in one facility. That's more than most entire chains have, right?
So that's interesting, right? So if I hear from one side that there's oversaturation and that the market is stable and we don't need any more production, obviously the folks running that business think differently. It's not really our role at this point to tell people whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. We specifically are prohibited from controlling prices or the number of licenses, so we really have no tools in our toolkit. So if there's a desire to do that, it's going to be done at the legislative level.
And
All
so
right,
now
go ahead, Dan.
the packaging, the new packaging rules that came down are in full effect now as well.
Correct. And I think what we put in the rules is consistent with the guidance that we've been issuing anyway as to how we interpreted them. So I think it just helps. A lot of what we do is we look at the bulletins, which are intended to offer clarity on what's already in the law and rules. So obviously, if we need to offer guidance and be clearer, there's an opportunity there to be clearer in the rules themselves. So I think it's just codifying a lot of our existing interpretations.
Yeah, I just mentioned that because I seen YouBaked put a big old censored across their package. And I mean, I just like to see the ingenuity and the uniqueness and the thought that goes into, fixing some of this old packaging that these people were stuck with. So that's why I mentioned it.
All right, final questions before we let the director go, because I think he mentioned he's got 5 more meetings after this. So any final questions?
Those 5 meetings are on my day off tomorrow.
Oh, that's right. Tomorrow on your day off, you have 5 meetings. Okay, got it. So Dan or Robert or Rick, any final questions?
No, I don't. Thank you.
All right. Well, you're familiar with the show. We do the shameless plug, but in your case, it's pretty easy to find you. Now, is the website URL going to be changing when you change the name or anything like that? Or how do people best reach what is now the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, soon to be the Cannabis Regulatory Agency?
Yeah, so it's still michigan.gov/MRA. I imagine as we transition to the new name, we'll maintain that old URL at least for a couple of years so people can still link there. One thing is I hear folks concerned about not being in the loop when the agency is changing things. One thing I'd recommend is to sign up for our email distribution list. So if you go to that homepage, there's some good quick links up at the top of the page. Scroll all the way to the bottom and you can sign up for our email distribution list. That way you're in tune with what we're sending out, because we do send in a lot of information out that's probably most relevant to licensees who are active in the space, but there's information that's valuable to consumers too. And then we have the Consumer Connection webpage as well, which is geared toward the cannabis consumer and has some great information that we continue to produce and put out there. So go to the agency's webpage. You can follow my socials. I'm at Andrew Brisbo on Twitter, really active on my LinkedIn as well. So feel free to follow me that way as well.